Becky. It's really nice to be here. This is, I think, the second time that you very generously invited me to speak at DIMH, so it's a privilege to be here again. Lovely to see all of you here as well. So thank you also for joining. So my name's David NEAL. I live in Utrecht in the Netherlands, and as you might be able to hear, I'm originally from the UK. I trained as a physician in the UK, and I worked in London in the NHS as a physician, including in mental health services. But I'm not a mental health specialist, I'm not a psychiatrist. Before I went into specialty training, before I got that far, I actually moved into health technology. And the reason that I did that is because around 2016, 2017, when I started working as a clinician, I noticed two things. I noticed how much was happening in the development of innovative technologies. And I noticed how much of a challenge that was going to be to the way that we provide healthcare and the way that we support people in the healthcare system. Because the people that were developing those technologies were not necessarily the people that should be using them or benefiting from them. And that to me was a big, if not a red flag, at least an orange flag for, I'm not sure if that's going to take us in the right direction. So maybe as a clinician, that's something that I could better divert my time and attention to trying to see if we can steer this ship in a positive direction for clinicians and patients. And that started a whole other journey. And where I've ended up now, as I work at Amsterdam University Medical Center in the Netherlands as an assistant professor, an academic title. But what I really do is I try and figure out how people can get the most out of technology. And by people, it could be anyone, not just healthcare professionals or people seeking care, but just citizens, the general public, but in a health context. And I do that through scientific research. And I also teach medical students about technology and how they might use technology. And on the other hand, I try to understand how technology impacts people. So on the one hand, I guess more the positive side, what can we get out of technology? And on the other hand, what do we risk losing, or how does it affect us in ways that we may not be fully aware of? So those are kind of my broad interests. And I want to share, I guess, two ideas or two projects that I've worked on this year with all of you and discuss them. And I'm really also keen to hear your perspectives on these issues. So they both relate to AI, one very directly and one more tangentially. I'm going to talk about the first one first, and then we can discuss it a bit, and then we move on to the second. So I will introduce the first part now. So I did a lot of work with people living with dementia in my career until now. So people living with cognitive impairment. A lot of people with dementia also experience depression. And even if they don't experience what maybe would be medically or clinically defined as depression, one of the major impacts of dementia is that it can interact with people's identity, their sense of self, and their psychosocial well-being. And I'm interested in how technology can support people living with dementia and also with their supporters, their friends, their family, caregivers. But I'm also interested in maybe concerns that I have about technology as well. And so this piece of work that I've done is more on the concern side about how technology and dementia interact. So I've got some slides. I'm going to do a quick presentation and take you through it. I won't be able to see you while I'm presenting. I have already told Becky that she's free to interrupt me at any time with any questions or clarifications or points for discussion. And I'd like to open that up to everybody else as well. So if you don't understand something, or if you want to discuss something or make a point, Becky's also monitoring the chat. So again, please do interrupt me. I like being interrupted. Let me share my screen. Right. Could somebody open their mic and tell me if they can see my slides?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And hopefully now you can see it in the full screen mode. So yeah, so this piece of work that I did with some colleagues at the Maastricht University Medical Center was about generative AI and particularly image generators. So the use of AI to generate novel images. And I was particularly interested, there's been a lot of work around how, for example, image generators tend to portray surgeons as white men. So the stereotypes and biases that maybe are present in AI image generators, or indeed definitely are present in AI image generators. But we were specifically interested in the extent to which that applies in the context of something less specific. So a surgeon is a very specific kind of function in society, and therefore I think more susceptible in some ways to stereotyping. But we were interested in older adults in general. Obviously, that is a very broad concept, older adults. And then we also looked at the more specific group of people living with dementia. And we were interested to see how does AI, I guess, perceive, in inverted commas, or at least portray people if we ask to see older adults or people living with dementia. So I have some disclosures, relationships with companies and think tanks. I'm not reimbursed for any of these, but just to be clear on that. So maybe this is a moment to just immediately make this interactive. Which of these two people, or personas, they're not real people, which of these two personas do you think could be somebody living with dementia?
Yeah, thinking stereotypically, the second one.
That's really interesting, and obviously that is the point as well. It's about stereotypes. So why do you say that, thinking stereotypically?
Yeah, because this is a really sad person. The background is gray, you know, the eyes are really unhappy, I would say, you know, something like that.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? Any other specific thoughts that they'd like to share?
Yeah,
sorry.
The second person showing no emotion. The first one looks happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, I think both could have dementia or not dementia. I mean, the thing is, people with dementia can smile as well, can't they? So, you know, again,
yeah. So this is good because this represents both sides of the coin, of course, because the first speaker, I'm sorry, I can't see you, so I also can't see your names, but as you pointed out, if we think in stereotypes, as you said, you could look at the persona, the man on the right, and say, yeah, he looks very sad. Someone, the masking of the facial expression. And the third speaker rightly pointed out that actually we shouldn't be able really to say just from a picture like this whether someone has dementia or not, because as you said, it's you shouldn't be able to see that from a picture like this. Actually, neither of these images is from our data set that was from the prompt for people living with dementia. These were both responses from an image generator to the prompt that we just asked to see a picture of an older adult. But we'll come back to that in a second. So why did we do this research? Oh, sorry, it's a bit slippy on the forward and back buttons. So we know that it's growing use of generative AI, including image generators, particularly in online media. These AI models are trained on existing media content, so existing photos that have been tagged in particular ways and images. And we know that existing media contains stereotypes and often stigmatizing biases. So our strong hypothesis is that these biases and potentially stigmatizing stereotypes are present in images produced by AI image generators. But being able to demonstrate what kind of biases are shown and how that is kind of, how that presents in images was our first goal. And the second one was to really understand, is there anything we can do about it and how we use AI tools? So I don't want to go into this in detail, but we looked at 2 image generators, so Copilot, DALL-E 3, the model behind it, and Midjourney, which are 2 of the most, I think, well-known or well-used AI image generators. We had a range of different prompts. So I've deliberately put elderly person on the slide here to remind me that we used both recommended non-stigmatizing language guidelines to generate prompts. So older adults, for example, older adult is a preferred term. Elderly is generally not considered a preferred term, but we used a mixture to represent, I think, common language use rather than just the kind of preferred language use. So we have one class of prompts that was just around older adults. We have one class of prompts with slight variations asking for a person living with dementia, or a person with dementia, or Alzheimer's. And we had a control group. So we didn't add a descriptor, we just said man, woman, or person. And that's kind of an idea of then the kind of things that you get back. So we looked at kind of the content of the images, and we used a coding scheme to look at their facial expression that they're showing, so the kind of emotional content, which you also identified a second ago. We also looked at postures, and were they sitting down, standing up, lying down, the setting. So for example, are they in a nice garden, or as one of you pointed out, the gray background, kind of nondescript, and whether there were any kind of assistive technologies or kind of walking sticks, all of those kind of things in the background. We compared the groups with each other to then detect whether there were kind of these biases that we could detect in any of these features. And then we also fed these images back into the image generator to get, what they can also do is they can give you a description of an image. So we were interested to see, what does the AI then say about the image that it created from a very simple prompt? And I'll show you that in a second. So these graphs might be slightly difficult to read on your screen, but the most important thing to take away from this here is that you can see this dark blue bar it represents negative affect. So people that looked sad or angry or scared were coded as having negative affect. And you can see that in the category of prompts that were related to dementia, we had many, many more images produced where the persona had a negative affect compared to either the control group or the older adult group. Interestingly, so this was with Copilot. Interestingly, we saw the opposite bias for older adults. This light blue bar, turquoise bar, is positive affect, so people that looked happy. And there were lots more images that were produced by Copilot where the older adult prompt returned a persona smiling and looking happy, which we had not expected. This is then Midjourney, so no one ended up looking happy from the Midjourney prompt, which is why there's no light blue bar. Across all of the prompt categories, people either were looking sad or angry or confused or scared, or kind of neutral. There weren't really enough people that looked happy, that were smiling, to make a separate category for that. And again, what you can see is that also in this generator with Midjourney, you can see that for the dementia-related prompts, a lot more of them were shown as being sad or angry or scared. So something negative emotional content. Then I said we fed them back into the image generator to get a description. So this is an example. Our prompt was just, we'd like a photorealistic portrait of, and then an older adult, for example, or a person living with dementia. That was it. So this description is very revealing, because all of the rest of it is stuff that the AI added. So conveying a sense of sadness or despair in his expression. So it wasn't just us thinking like, these look quite sad. The AI model itself also was able to detect that when analyzing the images that it itself had generated. So to summarize, both of the tools, both the image generators, showed these personas also seated more often when it was related to dementia. They were more likely to be placed in an indoor setting than an outdoor setting. And when we looked at the specific terminology to see whether there were kind of better terms for prompting with, the phrase with dementia, so person, man or woman with dementia, actually seemed to have the most kind of negative affect images, so the most sad, angry, scared kind of facial expressions, whereas actually Alzheimer's disease seem to have less of a negative association. So our conclusion from this study is that, as we expected, both of these models show biases towards negative affect for prompts related to people with dementia. I also said the surprise result was that there was also a positive affect bias for older adults in Copilot. But we also know that there are stereotypes around the golden years, happy retiree. So again, that's the opposite bias maybe to what we had anticipated, but there is literature on that, and it's still a bias. So I don't think it's better that people always look happy in the pictures than that they always look scared or angry or any of the negative affect prompts. With these results, we created a cheat sheet about how to better use generative AI in a bias-aware way. And actually, tip number 1 on the cheat sheet, it's a kind of a checklist of questions to ask yourself, is do I need to use AI at all? Because actually, because we know that there's bias in media images, particularly of older adults and people living with dementia, there are image banks that people have created, for example, the UK Centre for Aging Better, which are deliberately designed to be non-stigmatizing, to break stereotypes. So in many ways, I think we would recommend, if you can, to use that. But let's skip over this. But on the cheat sheet, we say, as I said, the first question, have I considered alternatives? And then, have I chosen my prompt wording carefully? Do you really need to ask for a portrait of someone with dementia? Or do you really need to ask for an older adult specifically? So by removing those terms completely, you might get a better image. Or if you do particularly want an image of, for example, you do want an image of an older adult, really to be more specific to not just an older adult, but in what context do you want them to be portrayed? So the thinking should still stay with you, essentially, is the take-home message from this. So if you're interested, you can download the cheat sheet there. I use it. I just keep it next to me to think about if I'm using AI. Oh yeah, these are the things that I should think about. So I'm going to leave this part here and stop sharing for a second and see whether there's whether this generates any discussion or reactions or questions.
Thank you, David. I think we've got Mark who has a comment, question.
Yeah, it's a quick question. Do you think your work has highlighted inherent flaws in training models in image AIs, in the sense of developers just taking generic images and just without any nuance, and just basically saying this is the person with dementia, or this is the person with a broken leg, this is the person, etc. Do you think this is obviously having a massive? Do you think it's having a massive impact on your work and in the field as well?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. I think we've highlighted two things, actually. On the one hand, it does highlight that these models are trained from they scrape the internet, right? So anywhere that someone has ever put a photo of someone and then written somewhere in relation to that picture, this is someone with dementia, or not necessarily even that, but just imagery associated with dementia, scraped from the internet. And in some cases, there's no filter on that. So it is just a pure reflection of the biases that exist in existing media. On the other hand, when we were looking into this slightly surprising result from Copilot, that it seems to have a bias towards showing older adults as happy and positive, we read the main problem I think it highlights is lack of transparency in how the models are trained. Because you get down into sort of Reddit forums about hypotheses about Microsoft having built sort of then manual adjustments into whatever images are produced to try and actively counter the biases that otherwise are indeed inherently present. But there's no way of kind of verifying that. You can't find out. There's no academic publication on that. There's nowhere that we could find a reliable source that said, oh yeah, Copilot manually adjusts the images afterwards, and that's why they just overcooked that, so now everyone looks happy. So, but there's no, so I can't say that, but I also can't say that that's not true. So I think the lack of transparency in some ways is the main thing that is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Which is one more quick question. If I can put one more in, is that when you look at the lack of transparency, are there any forums for experts in specific fields, in terms of your field, dementia? Is any kind of forums or kind of collaborations in looking, say, with Microsoft and Copilot, OpenAI, etc.? Is anybody from these large LLM companies actually allowing people to add input into their models, or is it totally a closed shop in your view?
I'm not aware of anything like what I think you're getting at, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm just not aware of anything, I'm afraid. No.
Thanks.
Okay, just an update. So we're sort of halfway through the session. I loved when you said the thinking should stay with you. I think you said that. I'd have to go back and check, but I quite love that. We could probably take maybe one or two more questions, and then David, if you want to move to the second topic. Yeah. So if just put your hand up or put stuff in the chat. And I know the session after this also will talk about image generation and manipulation. So we have other opportunities to cover that topic as well. But I'd say, David, just go ahead. Keep going.
That's great. Just a second. Let me...
And I apologize, Kate. It completely slipped my mind to have your poem. We will fit your poem in, I promise. I'm just, very, very sorry. I just had a holiday, so it's not ideal to have a holiday before.
So I will make sure that I do this with that in mind as well in terms of timing. Right. So just before I share my screen, just to introduce the second piece of work. So this I mentioned is slightly more tangentially related to AI, but it underlies a very important aspect of how I think AI and health and healthcare interact. So I mentioned my background as a clinician, and I've always very strongly believed that the essence of healthcare is a relationship or multiple relationships between people with a need for some kind of care or support or help with a problem relating to their mind or body, and people who are there for them in some capacity to provide some kind of care or support. So it's relationship based. And I think to some extent we've forgotten that a little bit in medicine over the last century, because biomedicine took off, which has produced lots of great things like antibiotics and statins and all kinds of things that keep us alive. However, we have not seen the same progress in understanding the importance of relationships in healthcare, the mechanisms by which interpersonal interactions positively or negatively impact on our health and healthcare outcomes. And now we're on the precipice of AI dramatically transforming relationships, because now we can talk to computers. So now we have these novel actors of large language model-based AI systems, which clinicians talk with, which patients talk with, which citizens talk with. And we've already seen the first studies suggesting that maybe the AI models seem more empathetic than human clinicians. And I don't believe that, because I think that if you look at how those studies were done, it's not really what they mean when they say empathy. But but anyway, so I think there's a whole huge piece of work that we've just spent a century kind of ignoring. So I started to look into this, and I thought, well, first of all, we need to, ideally, if I want to kind of make an argument that we should work on this more, is there any evidence that the relationship between a clinician of any description and their patients impacts healthcare outcomes, particularly medical outcomes? There's lots of evidence that it impacts patient satisfaction, but that's for more of the money people always a more difficult sell than, and no, but it actually impacts medical outcomes. So I wanted to look into that, and I contacted a professor at Harvard who had done a review on this topic 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now. And I said, hey, let's update it. So that's what we were working on. So looking at all of the previous studies that have been done on this topic to see if we look at them all together, can we see an effect? So it's called a systematic review and meta-analysis. I'm going to share my screen and briefly take you through it. Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep, great, good. So the clue is in the title as to what we found. Interventions that strengthen the patient-clinician relationship improve healthcare outcomes. So it kind of gives the game away. We did find this, and we were able to demonstrate this positive effect of a good relationship between patients and clinicians and healthcare outcomes. But just to back up for a second, so as I said, Professor John Kelly, he's head of the program in placebo studies at Harvard Medical School. And in 2014, he did the first review on this topic and found a small but significant improvement in health outcomes after clinicians had received support to improve their communication skills or improve some aspect of how they related to their patients. 2014 is a long time ago. It was changed since then. There weren't that many studies that they were able to include, and there were a lot of issues with those studies in terms of how trustworthy those results were. And so that was the reason for wanting to update it. Plus, as I said, the context of AI potentially having a huge impact over the coming years. So these slides are a little bit more technical than the other slides, so I apologize for that. But essentially, we looked in databases of medical literature, of studies that have previously been done, and we looked specifically at randomized controlled trials. So those are the best kind of studies that you can do if you want to isolate specifically a causal effect of some intervention on some outcome. And that's why we consider a review of those randomized controlled trials to be what we call the gold standard evidence. And certainly policymakers, that's what they look at. This is what the kind of evidence that they're looking at. And this is who we're trying to feed these results to say, this is important. This is something that needs investment and further research and needs to be a priority in the health system. So you go and you look and you search all these databases and you have some criteria about who's included and who's not. So we included adult patients in primary or secondary care for a specific medical condition, any registered healthcare professionals, so nurses, dietitians, Korean medicine practitioners was one of the groups that we included, or at least in one study. And in terms of the intervention, as I said, it was anything that was targeted at the clinician, aimed to improve their communication with their patients and improve their ability to build positive relationships. So we found an enormous number of studies, that most of which were not relevant to the question that we had, which is always how that goes. So we ended up with 120 papers that we had to read to check whether they were really addressing the question that we had and whether they met our criteria to answer the question. And of those 28, eventually, we found 28 randomized controlled trials that looked at this relationship between the relationship and medical outcomes across a very wide range of conditions. So high blood pressure, cancer, diabetes, and And compared to the previous review, we found that we found a lot more diverse populations. So also people, women, pregnant women, people with chronic pain, lymphoma, dyspepsia, end-of-life care. So very wide-ranging. Mostly the studies were done with physicians and registered nurses, but as I mentioned, it's actually pretty broad. So physicians' assistants, dietitians, acupuncturists as well. Most of the studies, which is often, again, is typical of what we find, are from wealthy Western countries. And the result, this is all to say that we found a small, again, reasonably small, but significant effect of these interventions that improve the relationship between patients and clinicians and healthcare outcomes. So, for example, what this means is if you are being treated for high blood pressure and you're being seen by a doctor who has had some sort of communication training or some training to help them build a better relationship with you as a patient, you will have lower blood pressure in 6 months or 12 months' time than someone receiving the same treatment, but from a doctor that has not had that training, that support to improve their relationship with you. So that's what that means. And these numbers are a bit distracting, but to put that into concrete terms, the size of the effect is only, a few points on your blood pressure scale. So if you think high blood pressure is above sort of 140 over 90, for example, on that top number, that 140, if you have a better relationship with your clinician, you might see a drop of 4 points in that, so down to 136. But that's on top of any benefit you're getting from taking the medication that has been prescribed or whatever else you're doing to reduce your blood pressure. So it's a bonus on top of that. And I think that's the best way that you can think about this. I don't want to go through these technical details. I think this is important to say. So officially, I can tell you that we have low certainty in this result. Why is that? So the reason is that even in the more recent trials that we included, there were still quite a few issues with the methods of those trials and exactly how they were done, which make it hard to say for certain that this is a cause and effect relationship, that it's definitely the relationship that was the cause of that benefit. So that's why we can only say, well, we found the same result with more studies in more diverse populations, but it's still technically, officially, it's a low certainty result. So I think, and just to bring that, because I don't have a slide on that, but just to bring that back to AI, I think what this means in terms of AI is, on the one hand, if AI, or the use of AI, or the use of any technology, in fact, the use of any technology in a healthcare setting detracts in some way or harms in some way the relationship between patients and clinicians, it will be harming our health. It'll be harming health outcomes. On the other hand, as I pointed out, I'm not all doom and gloom about technology, and I'm not a technology evangelist. I also am genuinely interested in the opportunities around healthcare and AI. And we can talk to AI now. And to some extent, there is the ability to have some sort of, you have to imagine that there must be some sort of relationship or sense of relationship that builds out of that kind of modality of communication. And if that supports people, if people have the feeling, have the idea of better support in that relationship, I'm also fascinated by the question of whether that has a similar positive, can have a similar positive effect as we found with the human interpersonal relationship. So I think it's an interesting question. I don't believe anyone has answered that question yet. I hope to do more research to address that question. But that's an open open discussion, I think. And again, I see risks associated with that. We have seen news items, we have seen research on negative aspects of relationships between people and AI tools. But yeah, I think it's the question is whether, to what extent is it a double-edged sword? Can we see some of these positive effects also in the AI, in communication with AI? So that is to leave you with a question for discussion. So
that's great timing, David.
Yeah,
I know you like interruptions. We have two people, Tim and Craig. They've put something in the chat, and feel free to just pause and if you'd like to speak further about the comments that you've put. So Tim is saying it reminds him of the work he's head of ops, medical doctors doing with the WHO around psychiatry open dialogue in Italy. And then another comment. So I'll just pause there. No pressure, obviously, Tim, but if you want to jump in, just talk over me. And then Craig, it's good to see further validation. Is the therapeutic allowance, the role of tech as a facilitator versus the relationship is notable. But yeah, I'll pause briefly if people want to jump in. Anyone else who would also like to comment or share or ask questions? Okay, yes. So Tim's on headphones. Audio might not be good. Totally understand. Don't worry. You can type away. And we've got a hand up from Mark. So, yep.
Yeah, it's just a quick question. In terms of your viewpoint on AI tools, do you think it's more of a duration thing? Do you think if you're obviously trying things out initially, is it kind of a short duration aspect or long duration, or is the prime mover with this the quality of interaction, obviously with guardrails in place? I mean, are you kind of in favor of using short duration initially, and then moving on and seeing how it works, like in a very iterative, slow process?
Yeah, that's I can talk about that. So personally, I experiment with AI, not in a clinical context, but outside the clinical context. So we do some of that is kind of simulated. So we do sort of simulations of kind of if I'm working with a patient now and I would want to use AI in this particular way. And there's a lot of more administrative tasks for which we've been experimenting with AI in our team. Summarizing papers that we don't have time to read, or I'm doing a project now that's looking at in the hospital we have so many treatment guidelines for different conditions, and what is the specific, you can imagine it's like these very complicated sort of trees of like, if this is the case, then look at this. If this is the case, then look at this. And then you drop out at the bottom with a treatment plan. And finding the right guideline and the right tree and then making your way through it takes a lot of time. So again, those are the kind of use cases where we're trying to experiment and say, okay, can we get AI to scan that and be like, here's my patient, where do I come out of the tree? And we're doing those mostly outside the clinical setting now because, of course, just because of the risks of it involved of going straight into a clinical setting. So far, the results are encouraging, particularly where we're working with tools that have the ability to reference the source of information. So, for example, in those guidelines, it's our own guidelines, and with an AI tool can then reference back to that and be like, I looked at this page and this guideline, and this is where I got this from. So we can then check and verify that. And that's working quite well so far. So I'm not sure about whether it's necessarily a short-term, long-term thing, but certainly starting with understanding outside a clinical context, how does this thing work? What are its strengths? What are the risks? And how can I mitigate the risks before I then put it into a clinical context? I think that's more the differentiator for me for how you can kind of staged progress use of these things, and also not being afraid to say, no, actually, this is not a good way of doing it. So I think the other thing that you just have to be, I think, very conscious of is we experiment with AI tools, but the fact that we start an experiment doesn't mean that we definitely have to. And I think, we hear a lot of I've seen a lot of negative stories around the idea of like 99% of AI innovation doesn't make it to the work floor. And I think, well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like the fact that it's really great that people are coming up with lots of ideas to experiment with. Great. But that doesn't mean that they all have to make it to practice. If they're bad ideas or they don't work, I mean, that should be just as celebrated. Like having bad ideas is part of having ideas.
Yeah.
So I think, again, it's about starting outside clinical context, figuring out what works and what doesn't, and not being afraid to stop things, but also then figuring out, like, when I translate this into practice, this is the context.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think my take on this as well is when you think of the marketing aspects of AI and this sense of, like you said, in terms of 99% of things may not work, and that's great, but people looking for 99% of things to work and make money off them, I think that's a dangerous thing. So when you take that out of the context and just purely doing it for, pure altruistic reasons, I think then we should get some interesting tools. But human in the loop is always the way. And it's always the moderation. Yeah. Like I always say to students, would you trust an AI with your life, your wallet, or your house? And the answer is normally no. So yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. I'm just going to interrupt. I'm going to read out a comment from Junior Campbell J. But just briefly on the note of risk within clinical settings versus understanding outside. As a clinician, I'm really interested to know what your take is on things like open evidence, which is a platform almost like a search engine for practitioners, just for people in the room. And let's just create a scenario where a doctor is in Europe and VPNing to try and use this resource that's not available. Just your thoughts on, in clinical settings, like what are the risks with that? And I can just imagine all kinds of things. And then just like to dovetail a second question, imagine a clinician who is not gaming the system, that's not the right language, but they are finding physical comorbid conditions to prioritize the mental health of the psychiatry patients, because otherwise they wouldn't be looked at within an A&E context, or something about how you can game such platforms. So just the risks, if you could just briefly, and then after that, I'll come to you.
Yeah, so we run in our hospital, we developed a tool whereby so that we can run AI models within our own hospital without sending data anywhere. So we run that model without sending any data to OpenAI, to Anthropic, to Open Evidence, to anybody, because I think you have to take seriously the implications of sending any data anywhere. And the way that people use a tool like Open Evidence, in theory, you can use that without sending any kind of personal medical information, because in the same way that clinicians have been using the internet for a decade or more to kind of remind themselves of, what do I do in this situation, or I have a patient with X, Y, or Z. But I think it can be a slippery slope, and you have to be very careful about those kind of things. The reason that people are VPNing, so that's pretending that they're making their computer pretend that they're in the US to access Open Evidence, is because it's now banned in Europe, or rather they've left Europe because they would probably have otherwise been banned. And that's because they don't have approval under the medical device regulations to essentially be providing clinical advice to clinicians. I have two minds about the medical device regulations, the MDR. On the one hand, the rules are there for a reason, and they're there to protect, ultimately, patients. On the other hand, I think the MDR is overly restrictive, and it really makes it very difficult to do a lot of kind of innovation projects. So just as an example, even when we want to do studies outside a clinical context of just testing new AI tools, it's very hard to do that in a way that doesn't make your study fall under the MDR. And if your study falls under that regulation, you have to jump through an enormous number of hoops, even just to do, like, I just want to work with 10 people and try something out in an office setting, because someone might in the future use that or cite that study as part of their regulatory application or something. So I think it has unintended consequences for actually doing constructive work to try and figure out how to use AI. But I agree. Like, I think if you're saying, like, well, I'm going to just start VPNing so I can use the system in the US. I'm just going to bypass the rules. I think you're taking quite a risk if you're a clinician and you're doing that. And we have alternatives as well. So I mentioned, we've been working with a couple of systems that are developed in Europe and running in Europe, which are better at referencing where information comes from so that you can independently verify it. So it's also, I think, a bit of a false dichotomy, and that's something obviously that has been blown up by open evidence themselves to say, well, it's open evidence or you're not going to get the best treatment for your patients, or you don't have access to the best information, right? But we still have the internet. You can still look up papers individually. You can still use PubMed and other search platforms if you want the latest studies. And we have these other European tools to use. So why take the risk is I think my perspective. And your second point around risk. Remind me, what was this?
Just a quick minor point, but if someone were to ask open
evidence.
Yeah,
I remember that. So yes, if you're trying to, so gaming the system. That is always a concern with any new system, and it's always been the thing with AI triage, or back when Babylon Health was a thing. In the UK, it's a company trying to provide this AI triage service, and they were doing it in London, and people would just game it and be like, yeah, I've got this really bad chest pain, please, and they were like, oh, you should go to A&E. Excellent. And I don't think that anyone has convincingly solved that yet, because any system can be gamed, and we're risk averse. So that, even if you suspect, and people with humans, we have this as well. Like someone says, I've got central crushing chest pain. You have to be pretty sure that somehow that you don't have to send that person to A&E as a clinician. You have to really kind of back yourself to have asked enough questions around that and figure it out and say, well, this is probably actually not this is not someone having a heart attack in front of me. So I'm not really aware that any system can solve that yet. The gaming the system. Yeah.
Thanks, David. We've got the comment from Jay. I don't know if you want to actually speak to your words, Jay. I'll just pause in case you want to, but I can read it out as well. So he's saying it reminds me of the book Cure. This is 2016, Jo Marchant. She does a journey into the science of mind over body, and she cites a number of studies that show a correlation of positive outcomes in healthcare provider communication relationships. So just going back to your previous point. So thanks for that comment, Jay. And I'm mindful of time. This is sort of the last couple of minutes. I'm sure you have to pack your bag and just get...
If I can just respond to that.
Oh, brilliant.
So thank you, Jay. I think I completely agree with you. I think the thing that we really wanted to add with this study is, we always have this correlation does not equal causation kind of mantra in the sort of positivist scientific world. And so being able to look at studies where as much as humanly possible, or to the extent that it's humanly possible, we can say, and it actually is a causal thing. It's not just related, but it's literally, this is the thing that is causing the outcome in a way that no one can dispute. That was what we wanted to try and add, because I don't claim that we're the first people to look into this. Not at all. There's a huge body of work around this, including Joe's work and other people's work as well. So thank you for highlighting it.
Right. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if anyone would like to comment, or I know Kate's probably busy writing and thinking, so again, no pressure there. But any final thoughts or future directions that you are going to move in this space?
So, directed to me, I think, So, absolutely, I mentioned that I'm really interested in doing some more work to try and understand. We've looked at the relationship between human clinicians and human patients, and I'm really interested to see whether interacting with AI has a positive or negative impact on healthcare outcomes as that is implemented. So that's something that I'm hoping to do more work on. And I think also the other big thing, as I said, I mean, we have a century of progress in looking at mechanisms in biomedical science. So how do things work? Because when you understand how something works, you can then answer a lot more questions. So should we implement AI in this context? Yes or no? Well, I mean, that depends on how it works and how the interaction is expected to affect something else. And I think so in general, the mechanisms by which the therapeutic relationship actually influences outcomes in a range of different medical settings. I think that's something, that's the kind of stuff that John and his group do in the placebo studies group. But I'm very interested to see what we can contribute to that from our, where we're using technology as well and how that intersects. So those are my two related interests going forward.
Excellent. Okay, I might actually end the session a little bit early. If someone puts their hand up, that's fine. We can keep going, but just again, mindful.
Kate's poem.
Yes, I don't want to put pressure on you, Kate, but if
there's no pressure. There's no pressure.
Excellent.
So you've got a choice. You can have the poem I could have read at the beginning, or the poem that I've written listening to David's talk, which is basically me just summarising the concepts that stood out to me. Should I do that? I'll do that second one. Right, David. Here's what I heard. David from Utrecht is exploring how tech impacts us. Can we benefit from technologies by steering the ship differently? He shared 2 AI projects, how Copilot and Midjourney visualize older adults living with dementia. These novel image generators were analyzed on features, effects, posture, setting, assistive tech. No surprise, images stereotypical and stigmatized, sad, angry, scared faces, described by AI additionally as full of despair. So let's be bias aware, use the cheat sheet. Alternatives were shared so the thinking stays with you. Number 2, healthcare is relationship based. At its heart, we've forgotten this. The pills and potions have progressed, but relationships much less. And now we're on this precipice. Are LLMs more empathetic than clinicians? Is this what people believe in? What are the interventions that strengthen patient-clinician relationships? 12,000 papers reduced to 28 of randomized control trials best to isolate causal effect. Communication training does create a bonus, an uptick in results. And LLMs can detract from this and outcomes can be harmed. However, if we can discover opportunities here and patients feel better supported through tech and clinician together, is food for thought. Experimentation is learning that 99% failure is okay because we don't need bad ideas anyway. And this AI interaction is a future inquiry where mechanisms with relationships that develop future contributions could generate, I hadn't finished the poem, more curiosity. We'll finish there. Thank you, David.
Wow. That's amazing.
That's what you said.
That's definitely not what I said.
It
That's
is.
fantastic. Wow. I'm so grateful to you being here, Kate. I didn't know what to expect, but I didn't expect that. It's phenomenal. Thank you.